Thank you all for joining our second Ag Resilience Focused Farmer Breakfast webinar. This one is following on from, we've had the Foundations for Success with Bron Steddle from Pinion Advisory, and then followed on with Focus on Finance with Chris Scheid from More Consulting. And today, to lead into that decision-making part of the equation, we've got Cam Nicholson from Nicon Ag on the art of decision-making. So remember, if you haven't caught up on some of those webinars, they are all available on the Livestock SA website, and they should be available on the Sheep Connect website as well. So if you are looking for those previous recordings, please go and seek them out. They're very worthwhile, and we've had some really fantastic feedback on them. So I'm Penny Keynes. I'm the project manager for Livestock SA, the state farming organisation here in South Australia. We represent sheep and goat and cattle producers here, and really are here to try and make a difference and strengthen our industry. And this series today has really been put together because we've observed that producers and the industry is looking and feeling a little bit under pressure. So while the long-term outlook is very positive for our industry, we see that the livestock price decline and the weather forecast is really putting a bit of pressure on. So we're just trying to put these workshops, quick webinars together to try and give you some pointers and hints, and then lead you into some other options for where you might be able to seek out information. So generously, we've been funded today by the Farm Business Resilience Program through PIRSA and the Commonwealth Government, with support from the SA Livestock Consultants, Sheep Connect SA, and AgX Alliance. So we've got some really fantastic partners on board that are really out there to really help support producers as much as possible. Our first presenter today is Cam Nicholson. So Cam is the Director of Nicon Rural Services and the consulting business near Geelong that works with grazing and cropping enterprises. Cam has worked in pasture agronomy and soils for 35 years and has been involved in many farmer programs for GRDC, Meat and Livestock Australia, Landcare, and the current Future Drought Fund. He provides consultancy advice to farmers and lectures on animal and pasture systems at Marcus Oldham College. And his most recent work has focused on understanding and discussing risk in farming business, carbon accounting, and decision making. Cam recently helped to revamp information and tools for MLA on pasture and soils, and he and his wife Fiona run a 400-hectare beef and sheep farm on the Bellarine Peninsula, turning off cattle for the long-fed feedlot market and fine wools. So Cam, I'll just start off by asking you what I'm asking all of my guests. How's it going in your part of the world, and how's your clients going, and what's that one piece of valuable information that that you're sharing with them right now?
Well, morning Penny, and thank you, can I say at the outset, for the invite. I do really enjoy talking about this stuff. From my part of the world, it's a tale of two parts, I suppose. Southwest Victoria is still pretty dry. And we're in that, what I'd call that uncertain period where you feel a bit anxious that you're not quite sure which way to jump. And then other parts of Victoria, with the rain that they had on the way through, are actually going to end up with a pretty good spring, summer. So yeah, different parts of the state with very different sort of outlooks on where we might go in the future. So it is timely with this decision making, particularly when you start feeling that bit uncertain about which way to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so what I'd like to do just in the short time we've got this morning is take you through two things I've learnt in the last probably 20, 25 years of working in consulting around farmer decision making. And I want to start off by a quote, and this is when I got into consulting, well, it's actually 30 odd years ago now, from a dairy consultant down in Gippsland. And he said the biggest difference between the top 20% of farmers and the rest is their ability to make good decisions earlier and more often. So he was saying it wasn't because they necessarily had greater equity or got greater rain certain times, they had better soil, all of that sort of stuff, which is what we tend to sort of look at. He said, no, they just consistently make good calls more often and they think their way through it better. And that really sort of, it stuck with me for a long period of time of thinking about this idea of decision making. And in particular, I want to, I suppose, challenge people at the start with this sort of a thought. When were you taught to make a good decision? And it might sound really odd because we make lots of decisions all the time. You know, we're making hundreds of them a day, some little decisions, sometimes pretty big decisions. But when we actually taught the process, and I put that in the context of the same way you were taught to read and write. You know, that's, if you think about what you can read now, you couldn't read like that when you were a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old. But over time, you practiced it, you learnt, you got better and better, and then it's become second nature. People don't think now if you're reading, you just do it. Same with mathematics and so on, same with writing. So I suppose the first message I want to embed with people is that what I'm going to show you is something that you can practice, and it's something you can get better at. And I think we need to think about our decision making as a skill that I can refine and get better over time. I've learned, as I said, a number of things around decision making. This first one, and I think is probably the most important one that I've learned, is the influence that what I call the head, heart and gut. And I pinch this from Jeanette Long, who some people may know. Jeanette's very strong on this sort of stuff, but your decisions are influenced by the head, which is the logical or the orderly approach. So it's sort of the numbers type stuff. And I fell into the fatal mistake when I started consulting, was that I thought it was all about the numbers. And if you could have a good case with the numbers, then, you know, lay down misère, that's what you should be doing. But realizing there was a lot more in particularly complex decision-making in farming. So the head is an important one, and a lot of our science is based on the head and giving facts and figures and that sort of stuff. But there are two other influences. The heart, which is the emotional stuff. So their values, our preferences, our beliefs, fears, things that we worry about that come into a decision that we're making. And the third one is the gut, which is, well, what could be best described as, I suppose, the intuitive part of the decision. And your gut really does influence the way we frame risk. And so the way we see things, whether they're risky or not so risky, is quite often based on past experience. So our knowledge and our experience shapes this influence from the gut. So, and I'll be really happy if all you take away from this webinar is that bloke that said something about the head, heart and gut and how it influences your decision, because I see so many people either conflicted in their decisions because of not clearly understanding this idea of head, heart and gut in your decision making, and that all three of them are valuable in some of the complex decisions we need to make. So we don't need to hide them. In fact, if anything, we need to bring them to the surface. Your temperament also plays a part in that. I haven't got a time in this webinar to go through the temperament side of it, but your personality basically will have an influence on how much you're a head, a heart or a gut person. Which is also interesting as well, because quite often explains why people are often at loggerheads about decisions, because they just covered it from a different angle because of their personality or their temperament. I now just want to go through 6 additional things that I think are important to appreciate when you're making what I call complex decisions. So I'm not talking about the simple decisions of, you know, how much do I drench these animals, because that's a simple decision based on weight written on the label on the packet or on the drum. I'm talking about complex decisions where there are lots of things to weigh up. And I just want to touch on 6 pointers. The first one is that in most complex decisions, there's more than one thing to think about. So it's what I call the list of critical factors. You know, if there's only 1 or 2 things to think about, you can usually do that in your head and do it reasonably well. It's when you've got multiple things to think about that makes it more difficult. So the first component of this is think about it in terms of, if I'm going to make a decision, there's probably a number of factors that I should consider in part of that decision. The second part is that each of those critical factors that we've made or we've identified have what I call tipping points. And tipping points are just where you think, oh, if it's like that, I might do something a bit different. So it will sway you in one direction or the other. And one that we'll all be familiar with, because this has arrived in the last few months. So if one of my critical factors was rainfall, I bet you'd think differently about your decision if the future forecast was for well above average rainfall, or well below average rainfall. And we've seen this with the announcement of El Nino. As soon as El Nino was announced, a lot of people went, oh, gee, hang on, I might think a bit differently about what I do in the future. So it was simply a couple of words and a bit of an understanding of what that might mean, drier than average conditions, that all of a sudden people reacted and was going to influence their decision making. So importantly, if we're thinking about making good decisions, is that not only do we have those list of critical factors, but we need to be able to tease out those tipping points within those critical factors. Third one that I want to touch on, and it follows on from the critical factors bit, is that not all critical factors are of equal importance. And by that, I mean, you can make a list of 6 or 8 things that you should consider, but some of them may and should have more weighting than something else. So it doesn't mean only think about the big ones and don't think about the little ones. You need to consider all of those, but we just need to build some sort of a system where we can rank or score those in a different way so they have different levels of weighting. And then the second last one I want to touch on is in decision making, it's pretty easy when all of the critical factors all stack up in one direction. In other words, there are 5 or 6 things that are all leading you towards selling or buying or doing whatever it might be. And so they're what I call the no-brainer ones. You know, so many things stack up in your favour. You think, well, it's obvious, I'll just go and do this. Where it becomes really tricky and where the angst is when you've got some on the pros side of that and some on the con side of that. And you're trying to weigh up some things that are in your favour and some things that are against you. And where do you get the point of what I say on balance, making that decision? Well, these things are on this side, these things are on this side. On balance, I reckon I should do such and such. So this is the really difficult bit. It's not the no-brainer ones. I think we can all get away with those. It's where you've got some on the pros and some on the cons side. And the last piece that I'll put in here is the amount of risk we want to take on. And so in making these decisions, I can have 2 people with exactly the same critical factors and set of circumstances in front of them, but some will require a lot more to be on the pro side before they'd say yes to it. Some will need less on the pro side to say yes to it. And that's a reflection of the amount of risk that a person wants to take on. So there's no answer to the level of risk that you want. Everybody's unique. That changes over time, it changes in your farming career, it changes even in shorter circumstances of what cash flow you've got and so on, to how much you might want to take a punt. But risk is a really important element that we need to include in our decision making as well. So the head, heart, gut, and these other 5 things, the critical factors, the tipping points, relative weighting of those critical factors, making a decision on balance and including risk, are all components that we somehow need to build into a decision-making process. And I might just pause there for a tick, Penny, if there's any questions or any comments that have been made.
I have a question for you, Cam. So I see a lot of working with producers, a lot of decision, I guess it's decision paralysis around not making a decision, the what ifs of what's coming, or what if I make the wrong decision because the season turns and I've sold all my stock, or the other way, like it's just so, how do you work through that?
Okay, I'll show you a process in a tick around that, but I think the hardest thing about that, Penny, is a lot of people try and do that in their head. And if I go back to those previous 2 slides, if you're trying to do all of that thinking, balance things up, weigh them up, make the right list of factors, make the right list of critical, tipping points and things like that, in your head, it is very, very difficult. And it's even more difficult if you're trying to do that on your lonesome.
Yeah.
I can do it. So if you're trying to do that in your head by yourself, you sometimes go, this is just so overwhelming, I can't think straight. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure if this is going to be right or wrong. So hopefully the process I'll show you next will help. And I've seen it help people. So I've got some confidence in learning a better process will help you out and help overcome that decision sort of paralysis stuff. Doesn't guarantee it's going to be perfect every time, but it helps, I think, compared to trying to do it in your head.
Yeah, and I think that also helps. You know, the process that I know you're going to bring will hopefully break down some of those barriers between if you are in a business where there's different levels of risk within the participants in that business. Hopefully, yeah, that same thing, I guess. Would you agree with that?
Yes, yes. So it's a process that allows other people to join in, and that'll be some of my concluding remarks as well, that hopefully people will identify.
When we're thinking about when you were taught to make decisions, it is also important to know how you are going. Are you going to answer that?
I hope the process you'll start to learn, you'll start to see some steps in that I think improves that. So the how bit of, well, how do you go about doing that? Hopefully some of these clues that I'll give you will help out on that.
And one last one before we get back to your presentation. Wondering where accountability to make a decision sits, as so many just defer decision making.
Yeah, but my very strong belief on this is if it's your decision, you've got to own it. And therefore you can't squiv it to someone else. And I know at times I've had clients that would rather I make the call for them.
Absolutely.
But sorry, it's your decision and you're going to have to, you should own it.
Yep.
Now, I think we can do things, and I've done this with clients and it works well, is if we think it through, you have more confidence in those decisions. The other thing that I'll just say is that sometimes the best laid or best planned decisions still go wrong. And particularly in agriculture, we're dealing with a very uncertain biological system that we're trying to operate in. And so sometimes you can beat yourself up thinking, I've made the wrong decision in hindsight. But you only know if it's the right decision in hindsight once you've rolled the dice and you've seen it play out. And so I say to people, the best thing and the way we've just got to think about this is at the point in time when I had to make the decision, did I have the best amount of information and did I use a good process that on balance directed me in a certain way or suggested I should be making that decision? And that's really the best you can do. But if I go back to that first comment that the dairy consultant said to me, that's what he was emphasising. It's not that they don't get it wrong. It's just that they seem to get it right more often and they seem to get it right earlier because they've thought through it a bit quicker. And this decision paralysis you're talking about, the really good people don't have decision paralysis because they've got a process, they trust a process, works more often than it doesn't work. And for them, in the long run, they end up in a better position. Now, what the process I'm going to show you, and there are a number of different decision processes about, the one that I'd like, and I first saw it in action with this fella here, Barry Mudge. He's a South Australian, as some people will know. And he was the first one to expose me to this type of process because Barry does like the numbers and the process and the thinking. And just over the last 15 years or so, it's just been, I've just refined it and talk about it a little bit more. But Barry really was the first person to put me on this, and he called it a decision matrix, and we've kept the name. And what I'd like to do is step people through the how. I think someone asked a question there of how do you do it? A 7-step process of the how. And what it does is bring together those previous things I mentioned around the critical factors, tipping points, level of risk you want to take on balance, which way do we make the decisions and so on. So hopefully you'll see as I take you through this process, you'll recognise those different steps that I mentioned before that influence your decision. So it's trying to address those in a standard process that you can practice and get better with. Now, in speaking to Penny beforehand, she said one of the decisions people need to make, and this is just an example decision. You may look at this and go, I'd do that a bit differently. That's fine. So think as we go through this, it's not about the answer that everybody should follow. It's more about the process. First step, and it might sound really dumb, but it's really important, is to be clear on the decision you're trying to make. I see too many people trying to put about 4 or 5 different decisions all in one. And that's where it becomes really, really complicated. So in this case here, I've just said a suggested this decision is, do I sell this mob of animals? So if you can picture that, you've got mob of animals there, you're thinking, do I sell these animals or do I hang on and feed them? Okay, and it doesn't matter which mob it is, you can apply this to any mob. So I'm just saying this mob of animals. So you're looking at a mob of animals and saying, should I sell them or should I hang on to them? Now, there are lots of different ways you could talk about a selling or retaining situation. This one, I've just used that as a decision. So it's about a mob that you're looking at, and your choices are, do I either sell these animals or do I retain them and feed them? So that's the first step, be clear on that. And sometimes as you'll go through this process, you go, hang on, that decision's not quite right. And you'll end up having to go back and revisit the decision to get the definition right. But I see so much confusion with people saying, oh, you know, I had trouble with this decision. I said, what was the decision? And then when they actually explained it to me, it's not clear in their own minds what they're trying to decide. And so it makes it really hard then to put a good process in place if you don't actually know the clarity of that decision. So that's the first bit. Second one is that I mentioned this idea we need to make a list of critical factors. So in this decision here, do I sell this mob of animals? If I asked everybody to pause, and I reckon in a minute, they'd be able to write down 3, 4, 5 things that they should consider in making this decision. And I can tell you, you will improve your decision making if no matter what decision you've got to make, if you just pause for a minute and physically write down what are the critical factors you need to think about rather than trying to do them in your head. Just the art of writing them down slows down your thinking and improves the things you consider. So in this one here, what are the critical factors? One of the critical factors might be the current versus the future livestock price. Might be one of those that you think about. But there'll be other ones as well. So I just quickly knock these together. These are 6 that you may consider. So it might be the type of animal that you're thinking of selling. Might be how long you've got to feed them for. Might be how much supplementary feed you've got available. Might be the infrastructure and time to feed them if you hung on to them. Is there any emotional attachment to them? So just in that list there, I reckon you could go through and say, well, the last one, the emotional attachment, is a heartbeat of the decision making. Current versus future price is probably more of a head thing, but it's probably also going to be informed a bit by your gut, because who knows what the future prices are going to be like. So you're doing a bit of crystal ball gazing there as well. So these critical factors allow you to reflect the head, heart, and gut in that decision making. And really important, because if all we do is look about the numbers and you don't think about the emotional attachment, and you don't think of some of these more subtle but logistical sort of things, you know, infrastructure and time to successfully feed, you might say, yes, I've got a containment area there. But when you start thinking about, oh, in the next 3 months, I've got all these other jobs I've got to do, having to feed them as well is going to be hard work. So you bring those other subtle factors in as well. So making a list is step 2, these critical factors. Yeah. Step 3 then is to put the tipping points around each of these. And my advice is that you take each critical factor in turn and you do this. So I'll just do the first one as an example for you. So if we looked at current versus future price, livestock price, and I say to people, when you start off, do the what I call topping and tailing. So the first description you put in there is what's most supportive of the decision. So what would, in other words, what would make you think I would sell this mob of animals? And it's only for this critical factor. So you've got to, the discipline is you've got to do each one in turn. So I would think it would favour me to sell this mob of animals if I reckon the price is really high now and it's likely to be much less in the future. that would drive me to think, oh, I'll cash them in, just from a price perspective. So that's the most supportive bit. Then you go to the exact opposite. So you go to the other end and say, what would be the least supportive description for that decision? Now, I reckon it would favour me to want to hang on to those livestock if the price is bloody awful now and it might be really high in the future. I think, oh, if it's going to be like that, that would make me want to hang on to them more. So it would drive my decision towards hanging on to them in the future as opposed to selling them now. So hopefully people can see that. And it's what I call topping and tailing. You put these bookends in to say, this is the most supportive description, this is the least supportive description. Now, they don't necessarily have to be numbers. Some people that like numbers, from the head, heart and gut, if someone's a very numbers person, they might want to put numbers in. I want the price to be above $4, and if it's below $2, that's fine. Some people just use descriptive terms. Doesn't really matter as long as you can separate out and say, if it's like that, I would think differently and it would drive my decision one way or the other. And in this case here, because I've got a high now, less likely less in the future, and low now, high in the future, there tends to be then a third one in between, or at least one more in between, which is the price will stay the same over time. So once you've got your top and your bottom in, you then ask, is there anything else in between? Hopefully I've explained that well enough for people to sort of get the concept of what we're trying to do. And you do that for each critical factor, and you do each one in turn. Excuse me. You don't jump from one to the other. You finish one off and then you move on to the next one. So if I do that for the whole lot, that's what mine looks like. So if I go down to this one here, I'm not going to go through them all, but if it's anticipated length of feeding required, if I've got to feed them for a period of greater than 6 months, then that would drive me towards wanting to sell the mob. If I've only got to feed for a month or 3 months or less, as I've described there, then I might hang on to them because I think, oh, it's only a short-term thing. But if it's a long-term thing, oh, hang on, it will drive me towards selling them. And you do that for each of them. And if we jump down to the emotional attachment one, I said, what would help me sell this mob of animals? Got no emotional attachment to them. As opposed to this mob, my best breeding ewes, and they've been in the family and the genetics for 50 years and blah, blah, blah. I've got an emotional attachment to that, so I'd hate to sell them. So that would drive me more to wanting to retain them. So hopefully people can see how you break that up. It does take a little bit of time, but is a really useful discussion to have, and trying to put them into words of what is it, where is that actual tipping point between those two. So that's the next step in it. The following step then is, as I mentioned, that not all these critical factors are of equal importance. And so what we try and do here is put some sort of a weighting so that we can reflect, sure, all of those critical factors should be considered, but some are more important than the other ones. And the way I do this, and again, the discipline or the approach again, is when I create them, I say all of my least favourable decisions I give a score of 0 to. So if everything was the least favourable, the score would end up being 0. So all the worst case scenarios, if you like, are 0. All the ones that are going to drive you towards retaining animals, in this case, are all 0s. Then you go and put the most favourable decisions on the basis of relative weightings to each other. So what I've done here is I've considered the price of livestock and the type of animals are the two most important critical factors I've got. And they, in this case here, are 3 times more important in their value than the emotional attachment. Doesn't mean the emotional attachment shouldn't be part of it. It just doesn't weight as highly. And then you'll see the other ones that I've got in there. Now, I'm sure people will be looking at this and going, oh, I'd have different critical factors in there. I wouldn't include that one. I'd include something else. Oh, my tipping points would be different. The values I would put on them would be different. That's fine. Okay. And I'm more than happy to enter a discussion with anybody to say, I think that should be different or the numbers should be different. And this is, in a sense, Penny, part of this owning the decision. That when you start doing this, you start owning, this is what I think should be included and what shouldn't be. And so when I'm working with a client on this, I will not give them the critical factors. I'll get them to first of all list the critical factors, and I said, have you thought of this? And they go, oh no, maybe I haven't. Do you think it should be in? Yeah, that's a good one. It should be in there. Or no, I wouldn't consider that. And that's fine. It doesn't matter whether I think it should be included or not. If they don't think it is, then that's fine, and it's not there. So hopefully people can see that. Lower scores first, higher scores next. And then obviously if you've got gaps in between, they're relative then to some of these other ones. So ultimately you'll get something like that. And I've just mocked this up as an example for people to see. Yeah. So that brings in that one about the critical factors, that they're not all of equal importance. The next step after that, once you've got all of those, is trying to find this tipping point. And this is a real challenging bit. Okay, so we've worked out this is what should be considered and how important they are. But when is they're more on the pro side, which means I sell this mob of animals, and when are they more on the con side, which means I hang on to them? Because you could probably see just with those quick 6 critical factors there, they will be different for each mob. So if you've got a mob of wethers, my emotional attachment to them might be 0, it might be nothing. But if they were our breeding stock from, as I said, 3 generations, the bloodline from 3 generations, I might have a stronger emotional attachment. So I can answer differently depending on each of those mobs of animals that I'm looking at. Okay. And the same with the price. The price of a certain type of animal might be different to the price of another type of animal. So they can be different again. So how do we work out where this tipping point is? Do we sell or not sell for those? Now, my suggestion on this is that first of all, you think, well, what are the decisions we could make on that? And I've made this pretty easy. This is a yes or no. Do I sell this mob of animals? Yes, I do. So that's the sell now one. Or no, I don't sell them, which is the retain and feed one. So they're the 2 choices I've given. Sometimes there are more than 2 choices. And we've got some of these made up for our farm at home that we use, which is basically keep a watch on it. So it's not just retain and feed and don't even think about it again. It's on the borderline, so retain and feed, but reassess in another month. Because in another month, some of these factors may have changed a bit more. Not all of them. The emotional attachment probably won't have changed, but maybe the prices or the amount of supplementary feed you've got will have changed, and therefore your decision would be different. So you work that out as well, the decisions. And then there's a little bit of magic that comes in here. And this is where you start to overlay how much risk you want to take on. Okay, because obviously where it tips to say, no, I'd sell these animals compared to I'll hang on to them and feed, has this risk overlay as part of it. And so the way I suggest to people what you do is you add up all your maximum scores. So if I look across here that you've got a 6 and a 6 and a 5 and a 4 and a 4 and a 2, that adds up to 27. And the magic is you multiply the 27 by 0.7, which is your tip over point. Okay. Now, there's a bit of science behind this, but not a lot. But I tend to find when I'm working with farmers, this is a reasonable starting point. So if I multiplied that out, 27 by 0.7 would give you 18.9 as the tipping point. So if it was more than 18.9, so if it was 19, it would go one way. If it was less than 19 in your scores when you did them, you go the other way. So that's your tipping point that you've determined. So in this case here, we would sell now if it was 19 or above when I went through this score. If it was below 19, I'd retain and feed them. Now, I tend to find most people jump at about a ratio of about 0.7. We've been desperately trying to do some more work on this to tighten it up, but it does have its origins from some work with financial planners. So when financial planners talk to people about how risky you want a certain investment portfolio, they go through and ask you a series of questions that actually has a whole lot of numbers and algorithms behind it. And 0.7 is about the tipping point for most people. So that's sort of where it comes from, even though it needs to be refined a bit more. But we can refine it in this next step. So hopefully people can see where that's come from. Little bit of magic, a little bit of trust in that to go 0.7 times my number to get that calculation, but that's the way it drops out to start with. Okay. Then the last thing we do is do some scenario testing. And this is a super important part about it. And what I get people to do is say, have you in the past ever had a decision to have to sell a mob of animals or retain them? So have you ever had to make this decision before in the past? And most people have. And then you say, if you have, in hindsight, do you know whether it worked out well, or you looked on it in hindsight and said, no, that was the wrong decision to make? And most people can think of scenarios where, yeah, I did that, that was a really good decision, or I did that and that was a bad decision, I shouldn't have done that. And I say, use that to then do a mock score on these. So we go through and we do this scenario testing. So it's based on your experience and whether it was a right decision or not at the end. And so here's an example where I've gone through and just scored it. So I've said here, I reckon going forward, if I'm thinking about today, thinking about last time, the price didn't change over time. They were non-breeders, but they would have had value if I could have made them heavier, but they weren't super important to us. I'd have to feed for, I reckon, 3 to 6 months in that scenario. I had little feed on hand, so I had to buy some in and so on. And you scored each of those, got a score of 20. And so the decision there would be I'd sell that mob of animals. Because on balance, there is more that's pushing you towards selling than it is to retaining. And if you can think, yeah, I sold them, and yes, that was the right decision, then the system might be working all right. If you go, no, it's telling me to sell them, and I know that was the wrong decision to make, some of these scores or this tip over point here isn't quite right. So refining it by looking at some of your past experiences is a very critical final step in the whole process to start to get that right. And then you can do future ones. You can play around with these scenarios multiple times over, see which things are driving it, because sometimes one thing mightn't get a good score, but a whole lot of other things do. And on balance, a lot of the smaller critical factors are actually enough to drive you in a certain direction or make a certain decision. Okay, so just to finish off around that, what I like about the decision matrix, a few things. First of all, it slows down your thinking. Now, there was a professor at Princeton University in the US called Daniel Kahneman. He actually won a Nobel Prize for his work on this stuff around decision making. And he said, in a nutshell, he's written some really good books on this stuff, a bit academic, but good. He said the biggest mistake people make is we make decisions too quickly. And if we slow down our thinking, we would make better decisions more often. And so this process, simply by going through those steps that I've shown you, might take half an hour, 3/4 of an hour to do first time. My wife and I, Fiona and I, can knock this out in about 10, 15 minutes now if we've got to make a decision, because we know the process and we're comfortable with it. Just that 10 or 15 minutes to slow down your thinking makes a better decision. It really does. It's a really important one. Second one, it makes it transparent for others to contribute or follow. And what I mean by this is that if you're trying to do this by yourself or in your head, you will get a much better result if you've got 2 or 3 people, other people who can help you. So they might be other people in the business. And I've done some great ones where we've had a cropping operation, a livestock operation, and when they're all together, the livestock people see it from a different perspective than the cropping people do. And so you get these different views, but it's also on paper. And once it's on paper, everybody can see it. I teach this at Marcus Oldham, and a couple of years ago, I had a student email me back and he said, I did one of these when I went home. It's the first time I understand why mum and dad make the decision they do, because it was the first time we actually put it on paper and I heard some of the critical factors and the tipping points that was in their heads, and they were doing it. It was just a given, and this fella didn't have a clue that's what was driving their decision making. So it helps with a lot of that sort of stuff as well. Third one, you can adjust it with experience. So we've had some of these now at home for probably 8 years. And the first thing we do before we use them again is to say, the last time we used it, how good was it? And do I need to refine some of those things on it based on how I know the outcome was? Yeah, we put too much weighting on this, or I don't know why now we have such and such in that. And if I go back to the Barry Mudge example, I remember the first time Barry showed me his, he had a whole lot of weighting. This was about How much crop do I sow? So this was sort of an April type decision. And he had a lot of weighting on the seasonal forecast and very little weighting as critical factors, in stored soil moisture. He learned over time that stored soil moisture is super important, and that the seasonal forecast in April, to know how that's going to pan out in October, November, is as good as useless. So when he first started, he had strong weighting on the seasonal forecast and not much on soil moisture. Over time, he's flipped those around quite considerably. And in fact, he's advanced further than the decision matrix stuff now. But that's a really good example of, as I start doing this, I think, oh, I'll put too much emphasis on that one and not enough on something else. Or you learn from other people and so on. And just the last point on this is it narrows down what information you want and the skills you need. Once you've made a decision matrix like this, and if I went back to that previous decision matrix, I can see what information I need at my fingertips. I need to know price information at my fingertips. So have I set that up? I need to understand how much feed I've got on supplementary feed. So have I really got a handle on that yet? So it takes you away from just hoping about information and knowing this is the sort of stuff we need. And particularly for ones that are repetitive, and we have a number of repetitive ones at home on the farm, and they have things like, how much stored soil moisture have we got? Well, that's why we've got a moisture probe. So I can get that reading quickly. How much feed on offer is an important one that we've got on ours. Now I can take a day going around measuring 40 paddocks, or I now subscribe to a high resolution satellite imagery stuff that means I can do it in 5 minutes, because I need to know that number as part of my decision making. And so it helps me get rid of tech that I don't need and I don't want, and just fills up my head, and I concentrate on the things that I do need information around. And just finally, remember, it's a skill, and like all skills, with practice, you get better at it. First time I picked up a golf club, I was hopeless at it. I'm still pretty hopeless at it, but the more you practice it, the more you picked up any ball, any tennis racket or whatever else. First time I picked it up, you weren't much good. The more practice you do, particularly if you've got some coaching in there, the more practice you just get better at it. Couple of resources just to finish off, Penny. First of all, this is a really good one. This has got this information in it. It's put together by a team including Jeanette Logg and Barry Mudge and a few others. It's the farm decision-making stuff with the GRDC. You can just download that free. It's a PDF, and it's got this type of stuff plus a whole lot of other bits of info in it. There is a video that was made. My wife and I feature in this. This is one of the ones that we've got at home. So if you want to revisit the process on the way through, there's an example that we use. It's on the Southern Farming Systems YouTube channel. And it's called Building a Decision Matrix. And this is one about adjusting stock going into spring and summer. So whether we adjust stock or do more conservation feed, fodder conservation and so on. And then the final one is there is a free online tool called Decision Wizard. Now, all Decision Wizard does is it makes you do that 7-step process. So if you're thinking about how do I go through this, the first thing it says, clearly define your decision. So you type that in. Then the next thing it'll say, please list your critical factors. And it won't let you move on until you've listed all your critical factors. And then it makes each of those critical factors and asks for the tipping points, and it asks for your most favourable, then your least favourable. So it, in a sense, forces you to go through those steps on the way through. You create your own login on this, and then you have your own file of decisions, so you can copy them and you can go back and change them over time. So it's a storage, if you like, of those. And the final thing Decisions Wizard's got is at the end, once you've done your scenario testing, if you're happy to share that with people, you click on make this public, and it goes into what we've called an e-library. So it's a public library. It doesn't say who created it, and you can't download that, but you can get some ideas by looking at some other selling examples, for argument's sake. And I've had a lot of people say it's really good because I go in there and it's some critical factors I hadn't really thought of. Someone else has put them in. Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I should have thought about that one. And so it allows you to see those, and you just search it. So if you put in selling, it would bring up all the examples that have got selling in them. And I will pull up there.
That's great. Thanks,
Penny?
Cam, for sharing those resources. Are they all free and
Yes,
accessible? Yeah,
yes, yeah.
fantastic. I guess from my perspective, Cam, what I've been thinking about throughout this is, and I think I know the answer to it, but with the tool, if it comes out with a decision that you're not comfortable with, even though it's over that 70% or zero point 0.7, it meets the rating that you would make a decision based on. What are your thoughts about that?
So two obvious things. One is that the 0.7 isn't right for you,
Yep.
which is probably reflecting a bit of the risk. So if you, for this decision, were less risk averse, so if I went back to that example that we had there, it might have to be so if you were happy to sort of sell earlier, that score mightn't be 19, it might be 16 is your tipping point, or that some of the numbers you've got in your relative weightings for those critical critical factors are wrong. You've weighted some too heavily and not others. And that was a classic one. I mentioned the one with Barry. We've done exactly the same thing at home. Over time, we've said, gee, we're putting too much weight on that. We shouldn't be trusting that as much as we do, because over time we're learning that ain't right. Or when you go through it in your scenario testing, as you've just said in the first case, is you go, why is that number so big? And you go back and you go, oh, because we've said it's a value of 8 on such and such. Is that really 8? No, it's probably not actually. When you think about it, it should be much less than that.
Yeah.
So it sort of drags out those numbers. And in trying to get those numbers in the first place, I just say to people, run with your gut feel.
Yep.
What first pops into your head? Oh, I reckon that's more important than that one. If you do good scenario testing, you start to sieve those out.
And I love the comment you made, Cam, about it sparks conversations in these decisions, and it actually opens up communication, which sometimes when making a decision, people are shut down to their opinions and things, but it prompts that conversation.
Yes, and that's right. And you start to see how people put different emphasis on different things.
I love that.
And you can explore the reasons why. And sometimes for particularly more experienced farmers, it will be because I remember 15 years ago, such and such happened. And I think that's where the market students value it a lot, because when they go home, in their heads, they're knowing that, well, mum and dad or these other farm managers have had that experience. And so maybe there's something I can learn out of this. I think it's like this, but they've been there.
Yeah.
So I find it useful for a number of fronts. And so I say you'll get frustrated with it, and sometimes you think, oh, this is wrong, this doesn't work. It's a skill, and so you get better at it over time.
Yeah.
First time you pick up a tennis racket and try and hit the ball, you get really frustrated, but over time you get better at it.
Yeah, I never push through to get better at it. There's a question that's come through. Do you have a maximum number of critical factors you should have? For example, if we start looking at too many examples, it would be easy to get too many critical factors.
So it can go two ways. Some people want to put too many critical factors in, some people don't put enough.
Yep.
I've got to make this decision, I'm going to go through this process, but there's only 2 critical factors. Well, then you could do that in your head probably. So I usually say if you're around about the 5 to 8 sort of mark of critical factors, that's generally where you tend to pull up. Yeah, if you do get more, what you'll often find is that some of those become very low scores. So when you put values on them, you find, oh, well, that's only a 2, or that's only a 1, or and then you go, oh, well, what is it worth really including this when these other ones we're giving values of 8s and 10s for? So it will tend to cull itself out. I've found I've done probably 30 of ththese workshops with groups of up to 20 farmers in them, and we usually peter out by about 8. After that, if you're almost struggling after you get to 8 to try and think of other ones. And sometimes people will think of them and go, oh, no, that's not really important. So, I tend to say, let's just go. Any other ones that pop into your head, big ones that we should think of? And if there's silence, I go, right, that's it, we'll move on. If you've got to work really hard to try and get more of them, then you've probably hit your sweet spot.
So yeah, great session. I've really enjoyed that. I would just like to end the session quickly by highlighting our partner organisations. So the ones that we've worked with today to put this webinar series on has been SA Livestock Consultants. So the Livestock Consultants are a group of South Australian based independent consultants who provide services to the livestock industry across South Australia. So if you want to check them out, go to their website. They'll be able to help you with some of these decisions that you might need to make for your business. There's a number of consultants on there from all different disciplines that would be able to help. We've also had Jodie Rosé sitting in the background helping out tonight from this morning, getting myself confused, from Sheep Connect. That service there online is supporting the development of the SA sheep industry and is funded by the Australian Wool Innovation and supported by PIRSA, so the Department of Primary Industries and Regions. So check them out for all of your sheep needs. And then AgX Alliance, if you are wanting some extra support or looking for a group of people in your region that are doing some innovative research or looking at working through some of the challenges, these grower groups are situated across the state. There's a page on AgX Alliance that will have you linked up with them and working through some of these issues that we don't all have to face in isolation. There's also the Livestock SA website. If you want to go back over any of these presentations or keen to find out what else is going on, please go and check that out because there's a lot of information there. So next, I will just point out a few different services that are available. But first of all, I would like to introduce Judy Wilkinson, who is joined us online. She is a family and business mentor from PIRSA, and I think really highly of this group of business mentors. It's funded through the Department of Primary Industries and Regions, which I said, and it's really important service that signposts people to be able to seek support. Rural Business Support, the organisation that's committed to building a profitable, sustainable, resilient rural sector by supporting businesses, farmers, landowners and communities in rural and regional South Australia, as well as iFarmWell. I've just recently met up with the team at iFarmWell and their resources and modules on that website around helping producers' wellbeing and when they're going through tough times or when they're not, is a fantastic set of program, and I really encourage everyone to have a look at it and see if that can help. Upcoming webinar, so we've got the next webinar will be with Deb Scammell, so around that retain and feed part of the decision making that Cam talked about is obviously some key thoughts and ideas around what we need to do when we are feeding to retain stock through maybe potentially dry times. So you can register on that on our website. There's a link there. It would be really worthwhile and I think follow on really nicely from this session with Cam. So please join us for that one. It will also be recorded and on our website, so we can try and share those around as well. So also, I'd really be keen for everyone to keep an eye out for the upcoming activities in regions. We are hoping to host some workshops around the place, so we'll try and link you up with those as they come up, just to be able to provide support and build some community. Also, big thanks to our funding partners. It's always important to be able to put these types of activities on for producers, and we're very grateful for our funding partner in the Australian Government Future Drought Fund has helped to put today on. So very grateful for that, and also our partners. So, but grateful for your time today, and we will look forward to hopefully seeing you at the next one.